Hello and welcome to the second part of Chapter 20, Government Policies Towards the Foreign Exchange Market. I'm going to start us at the slide where we left off. And the rest of this chapter is really, it's a long chapter, but the rest of it relates to historical description. So, international currency experience. We had the gold standard from 1870 to 1914, and the gold value of each currency was fixed. So in other words, each currency value, a pound, a dollar, was tied to a certain amount of gold. And hence, as the value of gold varied, so did the value of currency. Britain was actually the central country, so they were the hegemony. And basically the pound was tied to a certain amount of gold standard. In the interwar years, we had, this between the First and Second World War, we had beggar thy neighbour policies. What does that mean? Beggar thy neighbour, it's where you devalue or depreciate your currency in order to make your exports look cheaper to the rest of the world, and that boosts your GDP. So your beggar thy neighbour, meaning manipulate your or lower the value of your currency so as to basically take GDP away from another country by making your imports or making your exports, which then become their imports, look cheaper or appear cheaper. Towards the end of the Second World War, there was a meeting in Bretton Woods, which is a ski resort in New Hampshire. Keynes chose this because he had asthma problems. John Maynard Keynes, the famous macroeconomist. And at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the Western world agreed to an adjustable pegged exchange rate system. By this time, of course, the US had taken over the hegemony, taken over the world as being the world power. So the US dollar was at the center of the system. The US dollar was convertible into gold, and all the other currencies were convertible into US dollars. So it was a one-way speculative gamble in many respects, because it was pegging to basically to the dollar. So as long as the dollar was stable, that was fine. But if the dollar became unstable, then the whole system would collapse, of course. And with the Vietnam War in the late 60s, that's exactly what happened. The US started printing money like crazy to support the Vietnam War. That led to inflation in the US that other countries didn't experience. And that meant there was pressure on the dollar to effectively depreciate. But it couldn't depreciate compared to other countries because the other countries were fixing to the dollar. So the system collapsed. First of all, in 1971, there was this Smithsonian agreement to try and kind of keep the thing together, and the fix that most of the other countries had to the US dollar was changed. But 1973, the game was up, and March of 1973, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. We went to basically a freely floating system, which is what we have now, which is, he calls it a non-system. So basically, the majority of major currencies float against each other, so it's more a managed floating system. But some countries have decided that they want to fix as well, which they can do. So if we look at this through time, this is from 1860 to 1913, you can see a lot of currencies were kind of relatively fixed. Relatively fixed in the sense that you can see this line. You look at the German mark, 0.238 dollars you get for each German mark. You can see the Italian lira, the Belgian franc, pretty much the same as well. They're fixed. You can see that certain currencies weren't fixed for all that period of time. The Argentinian peso and the yen for a period of time as well. Anyway, this is a description of really what I've talked about. If we look at 1913, And then, of course, 1914 to 1918, we have the First World War. So there wasn't much foreign exchange dealing going on during that time. Then we look at 1919 onwards. Well, of course, Germany had to make these huge reparation payments as part of the Treaty of Versailles. So you can see the value of the German mark goes from 0.2 something to less than 0.04, and then starts going down to basically nothing. It goes down to lower than 0.01. Then 1924, a new German government comes into power, and they fix the German mark. They produce a new currency and fix that at a higher level. You can see what happens during the Great Depression there as well, 32 onwards. During that time, the US raises the price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. In that way, the dollar is devalued, if you like, against gold. So you can see that at the bracketed part of this in blue brackets between 32 and 34 roughly. You can see though that most currencies were pretty stable during this time with some wobbles in there. Look at the British pound sterling during that 1932 33 period. It was wobbling around, and most of the others did take a wobble just before that depreciation in the US dollar. In any case, you can see mostly fixed exchange rates with some exceptions there. Italian lira and French lira for a period of time in the early 20s. Once we look at the period post Second World War, we see Bretton Woods in force there. Now, you can see the French franc devaluing. See, the British pound was pretty constant until around 1968 when it devalued. You can see the German currency revaluing, so going in the opposite direction. You can see that happening around 1961. The interesting one here, though, to a certain degree, is the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar was allowed to float for a period from 50, well, you can see when it is, 52 through to, I think it's 63. The Canadian dollar was kind of an experiment. It was allowed to float against the US dollar. And economists looked at that and they said, it seems okay to float. The reason why most economists were concerned about floating exchange rates because it was tried between the wars, and a lot of people associated floating exchange rates with some of the wild swings in the markets and basically financial and economic instability. So the Canadian dollar experiment was kind of an important part of why, when the Bretton Woods agreement collapsed, and you can see it start to collapse there in 1971, you can see it fully collapse in 73, why all the currencies were allowed to then float, or then all decided to float. And that's the end of this chapter. There's a lot more description, by the way, about the history there in the book if you would like to read that. Thank you.